Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spook Speaks. I know many of you tune in to these videos to help you to sleep, so I thought it would be a fun idea for everyone to share where you're listening from in the world. Feel free to drop a comment below, and if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get cozy and relaxed. Let's begin. Story 1. We moved into the house on a Thursday. I remember because it was raining and the drops tapped steadily against the windshield as we drove up the winding road toward our new home. It wasn't a large house, but the real estate agent had sold it to us as full of character, with its rustic wooden beams, sloping roof, and old-fashioned charm. My wife Lily had fallen in love with it the moment we saw it. The dark oak floors, the slightly crooked windows that let in too much sunlight during the day, it was everything she'd wanted in a house. A place where we could build a life together, maybe start a family someday. Me? I wasn't so sure, but I wanted to make her happy. That's what you do when you love someone. You compromise. But something about the place felt off. The second we set foot in it, I felt an undercurrent in the air, like a static charge just waiting to snap. Of course, I chalked it up to nerves and exhaustion. Moving is stressful after all, but that first night, that's when it all began. The house was cold. We had barely unpacked, and most of the furniture was still covered in plastic, which made the whole place feel like a mausoleum. I remember sitting in the living room after dinner, sipping on a beer, while Lily flipped through decorating magazines. It was quiet. Too quiet. Outside, the rain had stopped, and there wasn't a single sound apart from the occasional creak of the floor settling or the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. That's when I heard it. The first whisper. It was faint. So faint that I thought I'd imagined it at first. A single, indistinct word spoken in a voice that seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the house. It was almost like a breath, a soft exhalation that barely registered in my ears. I turned my head, trying to pinpoint where it had come from, but there was nothing, just the empty room and the distant flicker of the fireplace. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Lily looked up from her magazine, her brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "That noise," I said, feeling a little foolish. It sounded like someone talking. "Just now." She tilted her head, listening, but the moment had passed. The house was silent again. "Maybe it's the wind," she said, her tone dismissive. "This place is old. You know how these old houses are. They creak and groan. You're probably just hearing things." I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. The thing was, it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like someone. The next day was spent unpacking boxes and trying to get the house in order. It was tedious work, but it kept my mind off what had happened the night before. By the time evening rolled around, I'd almost forgotten about it entirely. Almost. Lily went to bed early that night, exhausted from the day's work, but I stayed up a little later, wanting to finish setting up the living room. Around midnight, as I was arranging some books on the shelves, I heard it again. This time it was clearer, more distinct. A voice. No. Voices. Multiple, faint whispers overlapping each other in a dissonant chorus. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as though the very house was trying to speak. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen. The voices were soft, barely audible, but I could make out snatches of words, though they didn't make any sense. Alone. Watching. Leave. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I dropped the book I was holding and took a step back, staring at the wall as though it might suddenly crack open and reveal some hidden secret. But nothing happened. The whispers faded, leaving me standing in the eerie silence once more. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and hearing things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong with this house. By the fourth day, the whispers had become a regular occurrence. Every night without fail, they would start. Soft at first, like someone muttering just out of earshot, then growing louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, tried to pretend they didn't bother me, but they did. They unnerved me. Lily hadn't heard them yet, which made me feel even more isolated. She went about her days as if nothing was wrong, completely unaware of the growing tension in the air. I didn't want to tell her what I was hearing. She'd just think I was being paranoid, that I was stressed from the move. But the whispers were getting worse, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she heard them too. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, staring up at the ceiling, the whispers came again, but this time they were different. Louder, more urgent. Get out. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice, it had been right there, right next to me. I looked around the room, but everything was still undisturbed. Lily was asleep beside me, oblivious to the growing terror that was suffocating me. I knew then that I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was in this house, something that didn't want us here. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I couldn't live like this, constantly on edge, waiting for the next whisper, the next inexplicable event. I had to figure out what was causing it. I started by checking the walls. Maybe there was some logical explanation, bad insulation, pipes rattling, something. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. The walls were solid, undamaged. There were no vents or hidden spaces where sound could be traveling through. It was like the whispers were coming from the very structure of the house itself. That's when I found it. The crack. It was small, barely noticeable, hidden behind a picture frame in the living room. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a hairline fracture in the plaster. But as I leaned in closer, I realized it wasn't just a crack. It was a seam. I pried at the edges, my fingers trembling until the plaster gave way, revealing a narrow, hidden door. It was old, made of rotting wood, and I had to force it open. Behind it was a narrow passageway, dark and cold. The smell of damp earth hit me immediately, a musty, decayed scent that made my stomach churn. I hesitated, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this alone. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, something deeper than curiosity. I stepped inside. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, and it sloped downward, leading into the bowels of the house. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to guide me. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling of dread became. It was like the air itself was pressing down on me, thick with unseen weight. At the end of the passage I found it, a room, hidden beneath the house. The walls were lined with stone, damp and covered in moss, and in the center of the room stood a single old wooden chair. But what caught my attention most were the carvings on the walls. Names. Hundreds of names, scratched into the stone in a haphazard, desperate fashion. My skin crawled as I stepped closer, running my fingers over the names. Some were so old they were barely legible, while others looked more recent, much more recent. That's when I saw it. My name, scratched into the wall as clear as day. A cold shiver ran down my spine and I stumbled back, my mind racing. How could my name be here? How could anyone have known I would find this room? The whispers began again, louder this time, echoing off the stone walls. But they weren't just whispers anymore, they were screams. I froze, heart pounding, as the room filled with the sound of screaming. It wasn't just one voice, it was dozens, all overlapping, distorted, like a chorus of souls crying out from beyond. They echoed off the stone walls, and it felt like they were coming from every direction, closing in on me. Instinctively, I turned and bolted out of the hidden room, the beam of my phone shaking as I stumbled through the narrow passageway. The air was colder now, biting against my skin, and the darkness seemed to press closer with every step. My legs ached as I ran, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I had to. Get out. The voice, clear as day, roared from behind me. I could feel it, the presence, hot on my heels, chasing me up the passageway. But when I finally burst through the hidden door and slammed it shut behind me, the house was silent again. The only sound was my ragged breathing and the pounding of my pulse in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, waiting for the whispers to return. But they didn't. Not at first. I wanted to tell Lily, to wake her up and explain everything, the hidden room, the names, the screams, but the words wouldn't come. What would I even say? That I found a hidden chamber beneath our house, filled with the names of God knows how many people, and I heard them screaming? She would think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. I went back to the living room, back to the crack in the wall where the hidden door was. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at it, waiting for something to happen, but the house remained quiet, still, as if mocking me. But I couldn't leave it alone. Not now. When morning came, I finally broke my silence. "There's something wrong with this house," I told Lily over breakfast. My voice sounded too loud in the cozy kitchen, cutting through the normalcy of clinking plates and the smell of toast. Lily looked up, her eyebrows knitting together in concern. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "There's a room under the house, a hidden room. I found it last night." She frowned. "What are you talking about? A hidden room? Where?" "In the living room," I said, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "Behind the wall. There's a door. I found it and I went inside." "Lily, there are names on the walls. My name." She blinked as if she wasn't sure she'd heard me correctly. "Your name?" I nodded. "And I heard voices, screaming." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Lily stared at me, her expression unreadable, before she finally spoke. "I think you've been working too hard," she said softly. "You're exhausted. The move, the stress, maybe you're just—" "I'm not imagining it," I snapped, the frustration spilling over. "I'm not crazy. There's something wrong with this house. You haven't heard it because you're not here at night when it happens, but it's real." Lily reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "Okay," she said, her voice soothing. "Let's go look. Show me the room." We walked into the living room together, and I led her to the crack in the wall. My heart was pounding, half expecting something to change, for the door to vanish as if it had never been there at all. But it was still there, just as I had left it. I pried the plaster loose again, revealing the hidden door, and pushed it open. The passageway loomed before us, dark and cold, a tunnel leading into the unknown. Lily stood beside me, her hand still clutching mine, but I could feel her hesitation. "You want me to go in there?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I need you to see it," I whispered. "I need you to understand." She swallowed hard but nodded. Together, we stepped into the passage. Lily climbed into the passenger seat, her face pale, her hands trembling. I got behind the wheel and slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The house stood there, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew what lived within those walls, and I knew it would never let us go completely. As we drove away, the whispers followed. Story 2. It started with a box. I'd been rummaging through the attic of my late grandmother's house, sifting through decades of old trinkets, yellowing papers, and dust-covered memorabilia, when I found it. It was tucked away in the corner, half buried under a stack of moth-eaten blankets and brittle cardboard. The box itself was nothing special, just an old, wooden chest with rusted metal hinges and a faded lock that had long since broken. But inside was where I found it. The photograph. I didn't recognize the faces at first. It was a faded black and white picture of a family, maybe taken in the 1920s or 1930s, judging by the clothes. They stood in front of an old house, smiling stiffly at the camera. There was a mother, a father, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy looked to be about 10, the girl a little younger. They were dressed in their Sunday best, though their smiles didn't reach their eyes. I don't know why, but the moment I laid eyes on that photograph, a chill ran down my spine. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the way the family looked, or how the background seemed to blur slightly as though the camera had shaken during the exposure. It was the eyes. The eyes of the children in particular seemed too intense, too focused, like they were staring right through the paper and directly at me. But I brushed it off. It was just an old photo, nothing more. Or so I thought. I set the photograph aside and continued sifting through the box. There wasn't much else of interest in it, just some old letters, a few pieces of jewelry, and a tattered notebook filled with illegible handwriting. I figured I'd take it all downstairs and sort through it later. But as I picked up the box to carry it down, I noticed something odd. The photograph wasn't where I'd left it. I could have sworn I'd set it down on the floor next to me, but now it was back in the box, nestled between the old letters and trinkets, as though I hadn't touched it at all. I frowned, feeling a prickle of unease, but I brushed it off. Maybe I'd put it back without thinking. After all, I was tired. I'd been cleaning out this attic for hours, and my mind was starting to wander. I grabbed the photo again and slipped it into my pocket before heading downstairs. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table sorting through the items I'd found, I took another look at the photograph. This time, something was different. The family in the picture, they were standing closer together. Their faces were still the same, their expressions frozen in that unnatural stiffness. But the space between them had narrowed, and the children's eyes seemed even more intense, almost as if they were trying to communicate something. I stared at the photo for a long time, my heart beginning to race. I was sure it hadn't looked like this when I first found it. But how could a photograph change? It didn't make any sense. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. Maybe I just hadn't noticed before. Maybe the angle I was holding it at was different, and the shadows were playing tricks on my mind. That had to be it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I woke up with a headache. The air in the house felt heavy, like it hadn't been touched in years, and the early autumn chill had crept in overnight, making everything feel damp and uncomfortable. I went downstairs to make myself some coffee and noticed the photograph sitting on the kitchen counter where I'd left it the night before. I picked it up again and my stomach dropped. The family was closer together, much closer. The mother's arm was now resting on the father's shoulder, her fingers curled just slightly as though she were gripping him too tightly. The children, God, the children. Their eyes were wide, and they were no longer smiling. Their mouths were set in thin, grim lines, and their hands were clenched into fists at their sides. I dropped the photograph, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't possible. It was a photograph, an inanimate object. How could it be changing? I bent down, picked it up again, and stared at it. My hands were shaking now, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I knew I hadn't imagined it. The picture was changing. The family was moving. I wanted to get rid of it, burn it, tear it up, anything to rid myself of the creeping dread that was crawling under my skin. But something stopped me. Some part of me needed to understand, needed to know why this was happening. I set the photograph down again and went to the kitchen window, opening it to let in some fresh air. As I stood there, breathing deeply and trying to calm my nerves, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty kitchen and the photograph lying on the table. But I could have sworn, just for a second, I'd seen the boy in the picture blink. By the third day, I was sure of it. The photograph was cursed. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking gently on a door. At first, I thought it was coming from the attic. Maybe something had fallen over, or a branch was brushing against the window. But as I listened more closely, I realized the sound was coming from inside the room, from the nightstand. I sat up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The photograph was there, propped up against the lamp where I'd left it earlier. The tapping continued, louder now, more insistent, as though it were coming from the very surface of the picture. I reached for the lamp, flicking it on, and my eyes were immediately drawn to the photograph. My blood turned to ice. The family had moved again. The father was now crouched low, his face inches away from the camera, his eyes wide and wild, as though he were desperately trying to escape the frame. The mother stood behind him, her hands clutching his shoulders, her expression grim and unfeeling. And the children? The children were no longer standing. They were on their knees, staring directly at me. Their mouths were open, twisted into silent screams, and their hands reached out toward the edge of the photograph, as if they were trying to pull themselves through. The tapping grew louder, sharper, until it felt like the walls themselves were shaking with each knock. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. I grabbed the photograph and threw it across the room, watching as it slammed against the wall and fell to the floor. But the tapping didn't stop. It followed me as I ran from the room, echoing down the hallway, growing more frantic with every step I took. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The tapping wouldn't stop. No matter where I went in the house, it followed me, quiet, persistent, like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get rid of the photograph, had to leave this place behind before it drove me insane. I grabbed the photo from where it had landed on the floor and shoved it into a drawer in the living room. I didn't dare look at it again. I didn't want to know how much the family had changed this time. But even as I closed the drawer, I could still feel their eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. I left the house and drove to the nearest town, determined to find someone who could help me. Anyone who might know something about the photograph, or at least tell me I wasn't losing my mind. I ended up at the local library, where I spent hours combing through old records, newspapers, anything that might give me a clue about the family in the picture. That's when I found it. An article from 1923. A family had lived in my grandmother's house, James and Evelyn Porter, and their 2 children, Michael and Abigail. They were found dead in their home, all 4 of them, under mysterious circumstances. The coroner's report said it was carbon monoxide poisoning, but the article hinted at something more. Neighbors had reported strange noises coming from the house in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Whispers, footsteps, tapping on the walls. And then there was the photograph. The article mentioned a photograph found at the scene, one that showed the family just before they died. According to the report, the picture was wrong. The figures had been distorted, their faces twisted in fear and anguish, as though they had seen something no one else could. The photograph had disappeared after that, along with any other evidence of what had happened in the house. Until now, I rushed back to the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get rid of the photograph, destroy it before it could do any more harm. But when I opened the drawer where I had hidden it, my blood ran cold. The drawer was empty. The photograph, which I had shoved in there just hours earlier, was gone. Panic surged through me as I frantically searched the room. I tore open every drawer, rifled through every stack of papers, checked under every piece of furniture, but it was nowhere to be found. The house was deathly silent, save for the frantic pounding of my heart. I stood in the middle of the living room, breathless and trembling, when I heard it. That soft, rhythmic tapping. It started faintly, from somewhere upstairs. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone gently knocking on a door. My stomach twisted with fear, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. I didn't want to go up there. I didn't want to see whatever was waiting for me. But I had no choice. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the stairs, my footsteps slow and hesitant. The tapping grew louder with each step I took, the sound vibrating through the walls as if the house itself was alive. My fingers trembled as I gripped the banister, the cold wood pressing against my sweaty palm. When I reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped. The hallway stretched out in front of me, long and shadowy, the dim light from the attic window casting eerie patterns across the floor. Every door was shut, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as though something was lurking just behind each one, waiting for me. I moved forward, drawn toward the master bedroom. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see something glinting on the floor. My heart hammered in my chest as I approached, my pulse thundering in my ears. The photograph. It lay in the center of the room, face up, its edges curled as though it had been handled roughly. I bent down, my breath shallow, and picked it up with shaking fingers. My blood froze. The family was gone. The photograph was empty. The old house in the background remained, the worn wooden steps leading up to the front porch, the dead trees looming in the yard. But the family, the mother, the father, the children, they were nowhere to be seen. A deep, suffocating sense of dread crept over me. I turned the photograph over, hoping to find some explanation, something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening. But the moment I flipped it over, the tapping resumed. This time, it was louder, closer. I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet, like something was knocking from underneath the house. My chest tightened with fear, and I stumbled backward, the photograph slipping from my hands and falling to the floor. I looked down at it once more. The family was back, but they weren't standing in front of the house anymore. They were closer, much closer, as though they were standing inside a room. Inside this room, their faces were distorted, their eyes wide and hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. The mother's hand was pressed against the glass of a window that I now recognized as the one in my bedroom. Her fingers splayed out as though she were trying to claw her way through. I dropped the photograph and bolted from the room. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every groan of the house sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept the lights on, huddled on the couch, clutching a blanket around my shoulders as if it could protect me. But I knew there was no escaping it. The photograph was alive, and it was getting closer. By morning, the air in the house had changed. It felt heavier, suffocating. There was an unnatural stillness, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the front door. But as soon as I opened it, I froze. Standing at the end of the driveway, half shrouded in the morning mist, was the family from the photograph. They weren't quite right. Their bodies flickered and shimmered as though they were caught between two worlds. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their eyes sunken into their skulls, and their clothes were tattered, hanging loosely from their skeletal frames. The children stood in front, their small hands clasped tightly together, their heads tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, rooted to the spot as they began to walk toward me, step by slow, deliberate step. They moved without a sound, their feet barely touching the ground. The air around them seemed to ripple and distort, warping reality itself as they approached. The closer they got, the colder the air became, until it felt like I was standing in the middle of a winter storm. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, twisting it until I heard the satisfying click of the deadbolt sliding into place. But I knew it wouldn't hold them out. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into the house's history. If I was going to survive this, I needed to understand the curse, to know why it was happening to me. I found an old newspaper article that confirmed the deaths of the Porter family. But there was more to the story than I had initially realized. James Porter, the father, had been obsessed with photography. According to the article, he had spent months experimenting with early techniques of spirit photography, trying to capture the souls of the dead on film. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights in the windows at night and hearing voices that seemed to come from the very walls of the house. Then, one night, the entire family vanished. They were found days later, dead in their own home, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The authorities ruled it an accident, but the locals whispered of something darker, something to do with the photographs James had been taking. The photograph I found in the attic, I realized, wasn't just a picture. It was a trap, a vessel. The family's souls were trapped inside it, their spirits bound to the image for eternity. And now they wanted out. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent than ever. It reverberated through the walls, through the floors, shaking the house to its very foundation. I could hear voices now whispering my name, calling to me from the darkness. I grabbed the photograph and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get out of the house. I fled through the front door, into the cold night air, and down the street. The photograph felt heavy in my hands, as though the weight of the family's souls was pressing down on me, pulling me toward the ground. I reached the edge of the woods, the trees looming tall and dark against the moonlit sky. Without thinking, I hurled the photograph into the underbrush, watching as it disappeared into the shadows. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the air around me seemed to shift. The oppressive weight lifted, the cold receded, and the world returned to normal. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, but for the first time in days, I felt free. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible, coming from deep within the woods. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping sound persisted, faint but unmistakable. My feet were rooted to the spot, torn between the primal urge to flee and the compulsion to understand what had just happened. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the cursed photograph. Yet something deeper held me there. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the woods, from where I had thrown the photograph. No, I whispered to myself, shaking my head in disbelief. I got rid of it. It's over. But it wasn't over. The air had shifted again, and that familiar sense of dread was creeping back. My skin prickled with a cold, clammy sweat, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching me from the darkness. The photograph wasn't done with me. I could feel it, like an itch at the back of my mind, gnawing at my thoughts. I started walking toward the woods, my steps slow and uncertain. The dense trees seemed to swallow the light from the street lamp behind me, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched out like skeletal fingers. Each step felt heavier than the last, my heart pounding harder as the tapping grew louder. As I pushed through the underbrush, the tapping stopped again, replaced by an eerie silence. The woods were unnaturally still. No wind rustled the leaves, no animals stirred. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I saw it, the photograph lying on the ground, perfectly intact. But this time, it wasn't empty. The family had returned. They were standing in the woods now, in the exact spot where I stood. The father's hollow eyes stared at me, his mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. The mother's hand reached out, her fingers curling around something unseen. The children stood at her side, their heads tilted in that strange, unnatural way, their eyes vacant and cold. They were closer. The photograph was no longer just a picture. It was a mirror, a reflection of this moment, this very spot, as though it had captured a reality that I couldn't yet see. My throat tightened, and I felt the overwhelming urge to run again. But before I could move, something cold brushed against my hand. I jerked back, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there, nothing I could see, at least. But I could feel it. A presence, a weight pressing down on me, as though the air itself had become heavy, charged with something malevolent and ancient. A whisper, faint and distant, drifted through the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were calling to me, beckoning me closer. Leave. You need to leave. I turned, my legs trembling, ready to flee. But as I did, the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees tightening their grip. I could hear the tapping again, this time coming from every direction, faster and more insistent. My heart raced as I stumbled through the woods, branches scraping my skin and underbrush tangling around my ankles. I could hear them now. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following me through the trees. The voices grew louder, whispering my name over and over, like a chant that echoed through the night. I had to get out of here. I burst out of the woods and back onto the street, my lungs burning, legs shaking with exhaustion. My house loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding. For a brief moment, I considered running further, leaving the town entirely, but something drew me back to the house. As much as I wanted to escape, I knew I couldn't leave until I confronted whatever was haunting me. The moment I crossed the threshold, I slammed the door behind me, twisting the locks with shaking hands. I stood there in the hallway, panting, trying to gather my thoughts. My body trembled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Suddenly the house creaked, as though it was shifting, settling under some unseen weight. The air was colder now, heavier. It felt like the walls were closing in, the house alive, with the same malevolent energy that I had felt in the woods. I walked slowly toward the living room, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The photograph, it had to be here. It had followed me before, and I knew it wasn't done with me yet. I stepped into the room and froze. The photograph was back on the mantel, propped up as though it had never left. But this time, the family wasn't just in the picture. They were in the house. The father stood near the doorway, his eyes hollow and sunken, his body twisted and gaunt. The mother stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her face expressionless. The children were huddled in the corner, their heads tilted at that same unnatural angle, their eyes wide and unblinking. And they were looking at me. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls warping and distorting as though the house itself was bending to their will. The mother took a step forward, her foot barely making a sound against the wooden floor. Her eyes locked onto mine, dark and bottomless, filled with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, my legs trembling as I turned and ran for the stairs. I didn't know where I was going. There was nowhere to hide, but instinct drove me up, away from them, away from whatever they were. The tapping started again, louder this time, echoing through the house like the beat of a drum. It followed me as I ran, growing faster and more frantic with every step I took. I reached the attic door and threw it open, stumbling into the dusty, dimly lit space. The air up here was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. The tapping was louder now, as though it was coming from inside my own head, relentless and inescapable. I turned to close the door behind me, but stopped. The family was at the bottom of the stairs. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring up at me, their eyes dark and hollow, their bodies still and lifeless. Then, slowly, the father stepped forward. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though he was a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. The mother followed, her hand outstretched, her fingers curling and uncurling as though she were reaching for something just out of reach. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. I had nowhere left to go. The tapping grew louder, faster, until it was a deafening roar in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, feel the cold sweat dripping down my face. The father stood at the top of the stairs now, his face mere inches from mine. His eyes were empty, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and then he spoke. "You're part of the picture now." I didn't understand at first, but then I felt it. A cold, heavy weight settling over me, pulling me down into the darkness. My vision blurred, the room around me spinning and fading until all I could see was the photograph, the family, and the house. And then everything went black. They found me days later, alone in the attic. The doctor said it was a breakdown, that I had been hallucinating, driven mad by grief and isolation. But I knew the truth. The photograph wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting, watching. And now, I was in it too. When they buried me, they buried the photograph with me. But even in the dark, I can still hear the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Story 3. I arrived at the old house late in the evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The drive had been long and uneventful, the kind of monotonous stretch of highway that makes your mind wander, slipping in and out of focus. The road that led to the house was winding, bordered by dense forests that swallowed the last rays of sunlight. The house belonged to my late aunt, a woman I barely knew. She had passed away suddenly, leaving behind no heirs except me. The lawyer's letter had been a surprise. My aunt had never been close to the family, a recluse in every sense of the word. But now the house was mine. As I stepped out of the car, the cold mountain air hit me, crisp and biting. The house loomed ahead, its dark silhouette framed against the dimming sky. It was an old Victorian-style mansion, the kind of place that creaked with every gust of wind. Its windows were large and dark, staring out at the world like hollow eyes. I had been told it was in disrepair, but seeing it in person was another matter entirely. The once white exterior was now a dull gray, paint peeling away like dead skin. The windows were clouded with grime, and the front steps sagged under the weight of time. As I approached the front door, I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from the cold, but from something else, a sense of being watched. I paused at the door, glancing around, but the yard was empty, the trees still. "It's just your imagination," I told myself. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was just as neglected as the exterior. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air was stale, carrying the musty scent of disuse. I flicked on the lights, half expecting them not to work, but to my relief, the dim bulbs flickered to life. I took a deep breath and set my bags down in the hallway. The house felt cold and unwelcoming, but I had no choice. This was my inheritance now, and I had come to spend some time here to decide what to do with the place. Sell it, probably. There was no way I could live here, not in its current state. After a quick tour of the downstairs rooms, each one more decrepit than the last, I made my way upstairs to find the bedroom. The stairs creaked under my weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was somehow aware of me, like it was watching. The bedroom was small but relatively clean compared to the rest of the house. A large window overlooked the backyard, and for a moment I stood there, staring out into the night. The moonlight illuminated the yard, casting long shadows over the overgrown grass and crumbling stone wall. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the old well at the far end of the yard. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was too far away to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable, tall, human-like, motionless. It stood there, its face turned toward the house, toward me. I blinked, my mind racing. Had someone followed me? Was it a neighbor or maybe a local checking on the place? But something about the figure seemed wrong. It didn't move, didn't shift its weight or take a step. It just stood there, perfectly still. I watched for what felt like minutes, waiting for it to move, to walk away, to do something. But it remained frozen, as if it were a statue. A cold chill crept up my spine, and I backed away from the window, pulling the curtains shut. It's just someone passing by, I thought, though the logic felt hollow. Maybe they didn't know the house was occupied again. But as I lay in bed that night, the image of the figure at the window burned into my mind. I couldn't sleep, my ears straining to hear any sound from outside. But the house was silent, and eventually, exhaustion took over. I drifted into a restless sleep, the figure still looming in the back of my mind. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. For a moment, I had almost forgotten about the figure in the yard. I shook off the lingering unease and got dressed. The day ahead was going to be spent cleaning and assessing the house. If I was going to sell it, I needed to know exactly how much work it would take to make it livable again. After a quick breakfast, I made my way outside to inspect the backyard. The well was still there, just as I had seen it the night before. An old, crumbling stone structure that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But there was no sign of the figure. No footprints in the grass, no indication that anyone had been there. I stood by the well for a few moments, staring at it, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy here, like the ground itself was holding a secret. The silence of the yard was oppressive, the trees standing still, their branches unmoving despite the breeze. I turned away, deciding to focus on the house instead. There was too much to do to be standing around worrying about shadows. The day passed uneventfully, but the sense of unease never left me. Every time I glanced out a window, I half expected to see the figure again, standing in the same spot watching me. But the yard remained empty. That night, as I sat in the living room, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and howling through the trees. I tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the figure, to the way it had stood so still, so unnaturally still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head toward the window, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the curtains, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood up, my body tense, and moved toward the window. The backyard was empty. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and shook my head. I'm letting this place get to me, I thought, trying to calm my racing heart. It's just an old house, there's nothing here. But as I turned away, I caught a glimpse of something in the glass. A reflection. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The next few days were a blur of cleaning and repairing. I spent most of my time trying to get the house into some semblance of order, but the feeling of being watched never left me. It clung to me like a second skin, making the air thick and oppressive. I started keeping the curtains closed, not wanting to look out the windows anymore. Every time I did, I felt as though something was watching, lurking just out of sight. The figure from the first night haunted my thoughts, though I hadn't seen it again. Until the third night. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I had been struggling to sleep again. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the old house and making it impossible to relax. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of the figure, of the eerie silence in the yard, of the well. Then I heard it, a soft tap against the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound came again, deliberate, like someone gently knocking. My stomach tightened, and I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Don't look. That was the only thought running through my mind. Don't look out the window. But of course, I did. I slowly turned my head toward the window, dread pooling in my stomach. The curtains were drawn, but in the pale moonlight, I could see a shadow, a figure standing just outside the window. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my ears, and my skin prickled with cold fear. The figure was back, standing impossibly still, its face just inches from the glass. It wasn't moving, just staring. I backed away from the window, my body trembling. I didn't dare open the curtains, didn't dare face whatever was out there. Instead, I grabbed my phone, intending to call someone, anyone, to tell them what was happening. But as I unlocked my phone, I realized something chilling. There was no signal. The phone flickered, the screen distorting for a moment before going black. I stared at it, my mind reeling, but before I could react, the tapping returned. This time, louder, more insistent. I dropped the phone and bolted from the room. Morning brought no relief. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What was the figure? Why was it here? And why did it seem to be watching me? I spent the day trying to distract myself with work around the house, but the presence of the figure hung over me like a dark cloud. I couldn't escape it. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt like a reminder that I wasn't alone here. In the afternoon, I decided to explore the house further. Maybe there was something hidden away that could explain the strange occurrences. An old journal, a letter, something that would give me answers. My aunt had lived here for years, secluded from the world. Maybe she knew what was happening, or maybe she had left something behind that could help me understand why I felt watched. I started with the attic. The old wooden ladder groaned under my weight as I climbed, the air growing colder as I neared the top. The attic smelled of dust and mildew, a dampness in the air that made it feel like the forgotten room was suffocating in time. Dim light filtered in through a small circular window, illuminating rows of old musty furniture covered in sheets. I rifled through boxes of old papers, but most of it was junk, bills, letters from years ago, photographs of people I didn't recognize. Then I found something. A small wooden chest, locked with an ornate brass keyhole. My pulse quickened. There was something different about this. The chest seemed out of place, newer than the rest of the clutter, as if it had been put here recently. I searched around for a key, but couldn't find one. Frustrated, I picked up the chest, determined to open it later. As I made my way back down from the attic, I stopped at the top of the stairs, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had become. The wind outside had died down, and the silence felt oppressive, like the house was holding its breath. And then I heard it. That same soft tapping, coming from downstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable now. Someone or something was tapping at the window again. Slowly, I descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. When I reached the living room, I hesitated, standing just outside the door. The tapping was louder now, more insistent. My palms were sweaty, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I knew I had to look, but every instinct screamed at me to stay away from the window. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped into the living room. The curtains were closed, but the outline of a figure stood against the fabric, shadowed and distorted by the moonlight outside. It was the same figure, tall, motionless, and watching. My stomach churned as I approached the window. My hands trembling as I reached for the curtain. I had to know. I had to see it. I yanked the curtain aside. Nothing. The yard outside was empty, the moon casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. I stared out, my breath catching in my throat, trying to process what had just happened. The figure had been there. I had seen it. But now it was gone, vanished as though it had never existed. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong with this house. Something I couldn't explain, and it was watching me. I grabbed the small wooden chest I had found in the attic and retreated to the kitchen, hoping to find a way to open it. The house felt colder now, the air thick with tension, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. My hands shook as I searched for something to pry the lock open. And after a few minutes, I managed to find an old rusted screwdriver. I jammed the screwdriver into the lock, twisting and turning until I heard a satisfying click. The chest opened with a soft creak, revealing its contents. A bundle of old letters tied with a faded red ribbon, and an old, black and white photograph. I stared at the photograph for a long time. It was a picture of my aunt standing in front of the house, but she wasn't alone. There was a figure in the background, standing by the window. Tall, shadowed, and barely visible, but unmistakably there. A chill ran down my spine. The figure had been here for years. It had been watching her, just like it was watching me now. I unfolded one of the letters, my hands trembling. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. "I see him again tonight," the letter began. "The figure. He watches me from the window, always standing there, always waiting. I don't know what he wants, but he won't leave. He follows me through the house, always just out of sight, but I know he's there. I can feel him. I've tried to tell people, but no one believes me. They say I'm imagining things, that it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But I know the truth. He's real, and he's getting closer." I dropped the letter, my heart racing. My aunt had seen him too. She had known he was there, watching her, haunting her, and now he was watching me. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump. The figure had appeared again, and now I knew that it wasn't just some trick of the light. It was real, and it had been haunting this house for years, maybe even decades. I spent most of the night pacing the floor, my mind racing. What did the figure want? Why was it here? And more importantly, how could I get rid of it? By morning, I was exhausted, but the fear hadn't faded. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger, more oppressive. It was as though the figure was closing in on me, getting closer with every passing hour. Desperate for answers, I decided to visit the local library. Maybe there was some record of the house's history, some clue that could explain what was happening. I needed to know more about my aunt and this place she had called home for so long. The librarian, a kind elderly woman, seemed surprised when I asked about the house. "Oh, that old place?" she said, her brow furrowing. "It's been abandoned for years. Your aunt was the last one to live there, and even she was a bit of a mystery. No one saw much of her in her later years." I pressed her for more information, and after some digging, she produced a few old newspaper clippings about the house. One in particular caught my attention, an article from over a century ago about a family that had once lived there. According to the article, the family had been plagued by strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, strange sounds in the night, and sightings of a tall figure standing by the windows. The family eventually moved away, but the house's reputation remained. Over the years, other tenants had come and gone, but no one stayed for long. The figure had always been there. My hands shook as I read the article. This wasn't just some recent haunting. The figure had been attached to the house for generations, watching, waiting, and slowly driving its occupants to madness. I thanked the librarian and hurried back to the house, my mind spinning with the implications. If the figure had been there for so long, how could I possibly stop it? And worse, what if it was getting stronger, more dangerous? That night, the figure appeared again. This time, it wasn't just outside the window, it was inside the house. I had been sitting in the living room, reading through more of my aunt's letters when I felt it. A presence in the room with me. The air grew colder, and the familiar sense of being watched washed over me, stronger than ever. Slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway, and there it was. The figure stood at the end of the hall, its tall, shadowy form barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, it didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at me. My heart raced, my breath catching in my throat. This was no longer just a haunting. The figure had crossed a line, entering the house, making itself known in a way it hadn't before. I stood up, backing away slowly, my eyes never leaving the figure. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze, and then it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. The floorboards creaked under its weight, and with each step, the air grew colder, more oppressive. It was coming for me. I stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the front door. But before I could turn the knob, the lights flickered, and the figure vanished. The room was empty again. I bolted out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran to my car. I couldn't stay here anymore. The figure wasn't just watching me, it was coming for me. Whatever it was, whatever it wanted, I couldn't let it get it any closer. As I sped away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the yard, watching me leave. But the yard was empty. I spent the night at a motel in the nearest town, too shaken to return to the house. My mind raced with everything that had happened, the figure, the letters, the history of the house. It was all connected. but I still didn't understand why the figure was haunting the place, or what. Story 4. I didn't expect to inherit anything, let alone a house. My grandmother's passing had been sudden, and the news of her will came as a complete surprise. She had always been a mysterious figure, someone I barely knew growing up. I had visited her a few times as a child, but our family had kept their distance, citing her eccentric behavior. Now, the old house was mine. I arrived late in the afternoon, the autumn sky already heavy with dark clouds. The house stood at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, hidden away from the main road by a thick forest. It was a large Victorian-style manor, its paint peeling and its windows clouded with dust. It looked as though no one had stepped foot inside for years. As I walked up the steps to the front door, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. My grandmother had always been something of a recluse, and I knew little about her life in the house. I had come here to settle the estate, clean up the place, and decide what to do with it. Sell it, most likely. But there was something about the house that felt off, as if it were holding on to secrets it didn't want to share. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a grand foyer lined with dark wood paneling. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the weak light filtering in through the windows. The air was thick with the smell of age and mildew. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. I set my bags down in the hallway and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me since I arrived. This was just an old house, I told myself. There was nothing to be afraid of. I would spend a few days here, go through my grandmother's belongings, and then leave. The first room I explored was the parlor. It was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, as if the house had been abandoned in a hurry. I pulled the sheets away, revealing a set of antique chairs and a large, ornate fireplace. Above the fireplace was a portrait of my grandmother, staring down at the room with a stern expression. But it wasn't the furniture or the portrait that caught my attention. It was the doll, sitting on a chair in the corner of the room. It was an old porcelain doll, dressed in a frilly, lace-trimmed dress. Its face was pale and expressionless, with large glassy eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. Something about the doll made my skin crawl, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It felt out of place, as though it didn't belong in this world. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The doll's eyes were unnerving, too lifelike, too focused. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed against its cold porcelain skin, I heard a sound behind me, a soft, faint giggle. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but the room was empty. The sound had been so clear, so close, but there was no one else here. I was alone. I backed away from the doll, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It had to have been my imagination, a trick of the mind. But the doll's eyes, those cold, glassy eyes, were still fixed on me, watching. I hurried out of the room, my skin crawling with unease. I needed to get some fresh air to clear my head. But as I walked through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doll's face, those lifeless eyes staring at me, unblinking, unrelenting. I tossed and turned in bed, the creaks and groans of the old house keeping me on edge. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the silence was oppressive. At some point during the night, I thought I heard footsteps. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. Soft, deliberate footsteps, moving through the hallway outside my room. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, waiting for the sound to come closer. But it didn't. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and then, nothing. Silence. I held my breath, my mind racing. Was someone else in the house? Had someone followed me here? But who would come to this place so far from everything? The thought of someone else creeping through the house in the dead of night sent a shiver down my spine. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. When morning finally came, I told myself it had been a dream, a trick of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had been outside my door. Something was in the house with me. The next day, I tried to distract myself by going through my grandmother's belongings. The house was full of old furniture, books and trinkets. most of it covered in dust. As I sorted through her things, I kept telling myself that I was being ridiculous. There was no such thing as haunted dolls. I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. But when I returned to the parlor that afternoon, the doll was gone. The chair where it had been sitting was empty. I froze in the doorway, my mind racing. I hadn't touched the doll, I hadn't moved it, and no one else was in the house. So where had it gone? I searched the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The doll had been here. I had seen it. I had touched it. But now it had disappeared, as if it had never been there in the first place. I was about to leave the room when I heard it again, a faint giggle coming from somewhere behind me. I whipped around, but the room was still empty. My skin prickled with fear. The sound had been so close, so real, but there was no one here. That's when I saw it. The doll was sitting in the hallway, just outside the door. It was facing me, its glassy eyes fixed on mine, its porcelain face expressionless. But I could have sworn its head had been turned slightly, as if it had been watching me the whole time. My stomach churned with dread. This wasn't possible. The doll couldn't have moved on its own. It was just a toy, a lifeless object. But as I stared at it, I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off the doll. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was very wrong with this house. The next morning, I decided to do some research. There had to be an explanation for what was happening. I needed to know more about my grandmother, about the house, and most importantly, about the doll. I drove into town and stopped at the local library. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, seemed surprised when I asked her about my grandmother. "Your grandmother?" she said, her brow furrowing. She was a bit of an enigma, wasn't she? Always kept to herself. People around here didn't know much about her. I explained that I had inherited her house and had found some strange things inside, particularly the doll. The librarian's expression changed when I mentioned the doll. Her eyes darkened and she glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "That doll," she began, her voice low. "There are stories about that doll. Some say it's cursed." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "Cursed? What do you mean?" The librarian sighed, rubbing her hands together as if trying to warm them. "It's an old story, goes back generations. The doll was said to belong to a little girl who lived in that house a long time ago, before your grandmother even. They say the girl died in a tragic accident, and her spirit attached itself to the doll." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Attached itself? You mean like a haunting?" The librarian nodded slowly. "That's what the stories say. The doll moves on its own. People hear it laughing, whispering. It's said to be harmless at first, but over time, well, the people who own the doll don't fare so well." I swallowed hard, trying to process what I was hearing. This couldn't be real. It was just an old legend, a ghost story meant to scare people. But the doll had moved. I had heard the laughter. "What happened to the people who owned the doll?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The librarian's face grew grim. "They all disappeared or went mad." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what the librarian had said. The doll had belonged to a little girl, and her spirit had somehow attached itself to it. It sounded absurd, but the more I thought about it, the more it made a twisted kind of sense. The doll wasn't just an object. It was a vessel, a conduit for something far more sinister. As I lay in bed, trying to convince myself that it was just a story, I heard it again. The giggling. But this time, it was louder, closer. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound was coming from the hallway, just outside my door. I stared at the door, my breath catching in my throat, waiting for something to happen, and then the doorknob turned. Slowly the door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond, and there, standing in the doorway, was the doll. It was standing upright, its glassy eyes locked on mine, its expression frozen in that eerie, lifeless stare. But it wasn't just sitting there anymore. It was standing as though it had moved on its own. I scrambled out of bed, backing away from the doll, my mind racing with fear. This couldn't be happening. Dolls didn't move. Dolls didn't walk. But there it was, standing in the doorway watching me. The room felt colder, the air thick with a presence I couldn't see but could feel. I had to get out of the house. I had to leave before it was too late. But as I reached for the door, the doll took a step forward. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The doll moved. It had moved, and now it was coming toward me. I don't remember how I got out of the house that night. All I remember is running through the dark, down the stairs, and out into the yard. The cold air hit my face as I stumbled away from the house, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the driveway, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I knew it wasn't empty. The doll was still inside, and it was waiting for me. I spent the rest of the night in my car, too afraid to go back inside. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. The doll was alive. It was more than just an object. It was a living, breathing entity, driven by a malevolent force. By morning, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just leave the doll there, waiting for its next victim. It had to be destroyed. I drove into town and stopped at a hardware store, buying a hammer, matches, and a can of gasoline. If the doll was cursed, if it was possessed, then I would burn it. I would end whatever evil was tied to it, once and for all. When I returned to the house, the air felt heavier, darker. I stepped inside, gripping the hammer tightly in my hand. The house was silent, but I knew the doll was waiting for me. I could feel its presence, lingering in the air. I made my way to the parlor, where the doll had first appeared. And there it was, sitting in the chair, just as I had found it on the first day. Its glassy eyes followed me as I entered the room. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I was angry. This thing had tormented me, haunted me, and I was going to end it. I lifted the hammer, ready to smash the doll to pieces. But before I could swing, the doll laughed. A high-pitched, chilling giggle that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, the hammer raised in the air. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam with malice, as though it knew what I was about to do. And then, in a voice that wasn't human, a voice that sounded like a child's whisper, it spoke. "You can't destroy me." The words sent a wave of terror through me. I lowered the hammer, my hands shaking. The doll had spoken. It had spoken in a voice that wasn't its own, a voice that didn't belong in this world. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something far worse. Something evil. I dropped the hammer and grabbed the gasoline, dousing the doll in the flammable liquid. The doll's glassy eyes stared at me, unblinking, as I struck the match. "I'll be free," the doll whispered, just as I tossed the match onto its porcelain body. Flames erupted around the doll, engulfing it in fire. The room filled with the acrid smell of burning fabric and plastic. But as the doll burned, I heard it laughing. It wasn't a giggle this time. It was a full, maniacal laugh, a sound that echoed through the house, reverberating off the walls. The flames consumed the doll, but the laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, more frenzied, as though the fire had unleashed something even darker, something far worse than the doll itself. And then, as the flames died down, the laughter stopped. I stood in the charred remains of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the blackened spot where the doll had been. It was gone. But I knew, deep down, that the evil wasn't gone. It had been freed. And now, it was loose in the world. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the events of that week behind me. I sold the house, moved back to the city, and tried to forget about the doll. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory lingered. Sometimes late at night, I would hear the sound of footsteps in my apartment. The soft, deliberate sound of someone walking through the hallway. And sometimes, just before I fell asleep, I would hear a faint giggle. Story 5. The sun hung low in the sky as I pulled into the driveway of my new home. My heart raced with excitement and anxiety. It was a quaint old house, one that had clearly seen better days. The peeling paint and overgrown garden gave it an air of neglect, but it was charming in its own way. My friends had teased me about moving to a fixer-upper, but I saw it as an opportunity to create a space that was truly mine. As I stepped out of the car, a chill ran through the air, a slight contrast to the warm autumn sunlight. It felt odd for September, and the wind carried an unsettling whisper that sent shivers down my spine. Shaking off the feeling, I grabbed a few boxes from the trunk and headed inside. The foyer welcomed me with an old-world charm. Hardwood floors, a winding staircase, and walls adorned with faded wallpaper. As I moved through the house, I imagined the stories it could tell. the laughter that must have echoed through its halls. I was ready to make my own memories here. After hours of unpacking, I finally sat down on the living room floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes and scattered belongings. I gazed around, soaking in the space that would soon feel like home. But there was something that caught my eye: a door at the end of the hallway. The door was small, wooden, and slightly ajar, its frame coated in a layer of dust. It was a stark contrast to the rest of the house, which was filled with life and warmth. Curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me towards it. What lay behind that door? I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the unpacked boxes that awaited my attention. The sensible part of my mind urged me to focus on the task at hand. But the door beckoned to me, and eventually I found myself standing before it, heart racing. I pushed the door open, and the hinges creaked in protest. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, leading down to the basement. The air that wafted up felt cool and musty, a stark contrast to the warmth of the house. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. Just a quick look, I told myself. With a deep breath, I stepped onto the first step, feeling the coolness seep into my skin. The wooden stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Shadows danced across the walls, creating an eerie atmosphere. The smell of dampness and decay filled my nostrils, making me recoil slightly. Boxes were stacked haphazardly in the corners, and an old rusted furnace stood ominously against one wall. I stepped further into the basement, peering into the darkness. A feeling of unease settled over me. The basement felt wrong, like it was holding on to secrets that had long been buried. I could almost hear whispers in the air, faint and indistinct, as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate. I approached one of the boxes and opened it, revealing a collection of old toys, dusty books, and forgotten trinkets. It was a strange assortment, as though the previous owners had simply left their memories behind. I rifled through the contents, but something caught my eye in the corner of the room. A strange, ornate mirror. The mirror was covered in a thick layer of dust, but its frame was intricately carved with unsettling designs. I felt drawn to it, a strange compulsion urging me to get closer. As I wiped away the dust, the surface of the mirror gleamed, reflecting my wide-eyed curiosity. But as I looked closer, my reflection seemed off. There was a shadow behind me, dark and formless. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of the basement, heavy and suffocating. My heart raced as I turned back to the mirror, but the shadow had vanished, leaving me alone once more. I shook my head, dismissing it as a trick of the light. I was tired, overwhelmed by the move, and my imagination was running wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I backed away from the mirror, deciding it was time to head back upstairs. As I climbed the creaking stairs, I felt a sudden chill wash over me. The air had grown colder, and a low whisper echoed in my ears. "Help me." I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The voice was faint, almost childlike. Panic surged through me, and I hurried up the remaining steps, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, heart racing, desperately trying to calm my breathing. "It's just your imagination," I muttered to myself, but deep down, I knew something was not right. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the day's events. Every creak of the house made my heart race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. I pulled the covers tightly around me, willing myself to sleep, but it felt impossible. Just as I began to drift off, a sound jolted me awake, a soft thump, followed by a faint giggle. I sat up, straining to listen. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. I climbed out of bed and tiptoed towards the hallway, my breath shallow and rapid. The house was dark, shadows lurking in every corner. As I crept toward the stairs, the giggle came again, this time louder, more distinct. "Come play." I froze, blood running cold. It was a child's voice, innocent yet filled with something darker, something sinister. I felt a chill creeping down my spine, paralyzing me in place. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence enveloped me, and I strained to hear any sound. But there was nothing, just the heavy silence of the house. I turned back to my room, ready to retreat. But as I did, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. The basement door was open. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers had grown louder, echoing through the hallway, beckoning me closer. Despite my fear, a morbid curiosity pushed me forward. I stepped toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The darkness beyond the threshold seemed to pulsate with an energy I couldn't understand. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs once more, the wooden steps creaking beneath my weight. As I reached the bottom, the air felt heavier, thick with anticipation. The single bulb flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I glanced around, searching for the source of the voice, but all I found were the remnants of a forgotten past. "Come play with me." The voice was clearer now, ringing in my ears. It was coming from deeper within the basement. I felt a pull toward it, an inexplicable urge to follow. I moved deeper into the darkness, my pulse quickening. As I walked, I felt a cold draft pass through me, and the temperature dropped even further. The whispering intensified, wrapping around me like a shroud. "Help me." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes as I called out, "What do you want?" Suddenly, the mirror caught my eye again, glinting in the dim light. I had forgotten about it in my fear. I stepped closer, feeling the urge to wipe the dust away once more. As I did, the whispers grew louder, almost frantic. "Help me! Help me! Let me out!" I recoiled, fear coursing through my veins. I was frozen in place, staring into the mirror, where the reflection was not just my own. The shadows twisted and warped, forming a face. A girl's face, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please," she pleaded, her voice a haunting echo in the stillness. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. My heart raced as the girl's face twisted into a look of despair. "Please help me," she cried again, the shadows around her swirling like a storm. "Who are you?" I gasped, my voice trembling. I felt a strange connection to her, a pull that urged me to help her despite my fear. "I'm trapped," she sobbed, tears glistening in her eyes. "You have to let me out. I can't stay here forever." The mirror shimmered, and I stepped closer, drawn to her anguish. "How? How do I help you?" "Break the mirror," she screamed, her voice echoing through the basement. "Please, you have to break it." I hesitated, glancing around at the darkness that enveloped me. If I broke the mirror, would it free her? Or would it unleash something worse? But the desperation in her eyes pushed me forward. With trembling hands, I picked up a heavy iron candlestick from a nearby table. I raised it above my head, my breath hitching in my throat. The girl's expression shifted from despair to hope, and I felt the weight of her plea wash over me. "Do it," she urged. "Please." I brought the candlestick down with all my strength, the glass shattering into a million pieces. A blinding light erupted from the mirror, filling the basement and casting away the shadows. I shielded my eyes, the brightness overwhelming. As the light faded, I opened my eyes, gasping for breath. The basement was transformed. The dust and decay had vanished, replaced by a vibrant glow. The girl stood before me, her form shimmering with a newfound energy. "Thank you," she whispered, a smile breaking through her tears. "You freed me." But as her words hung in the air, I felt a cold wind rush through the basement, and the shadows began to coalesce once more. Panic surged through me as I realized that the darkness was not gone. It was merely waiting. The girl's smile faded, replaced by a look of horror. "No, you have to run. It's coming back." Before I could react, the shadows lunged at me, swirling and writhing like a living entity. I turned to flee, but the darkness was faster, wrapping around me like a vice. The girl reached out, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. "Fight it. You can't let it take you," she cried, her voice filled with urgency. With every ounce of strength, I broke free from the shadows, stumbling towards the stairs. I felt the cold tendrils grasping at my ankles, pulling me back into the abyss. I reached the first step, my heart pounding as I fought against the encroaching darkness. "Help me," I shouted, my voice cracking. The girl's presence surged beside me, her ethereal form glowing brighter as she pushed against the darkness. "You have to believe. You have the power." Drawing from the girl's energy, I pushed forward, my body trembling with effort. The shadows shrieked in anger, clawing at my skin, but I kept moving, each step fueled by the girl's desperate cries. As I reached the top of the stairs, I slammed the basement door shut behind me. The darkness roared in fury, reverberating through the wood, but I locked the door, breathing heavily. The house was silent again, but I knew the danger was far from over. I collapsed against the door, trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. I had freed the girl, but in doing so, I had awakened something far more sinister. Days turned into weeks, but the feeling of dread never left me. I tried to return to normalcy, unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, but the echoes of that night haunted my every step. I could still hear the whispers in the air, feel the shadows lurking just beyond the corner of my eye. I avoided the basement, afraid of what I might find if I ventured back. But as the nights grew longer and the darkness deeper, I felt an insistent pull to return. One evening, unable to shake the feeling, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement door. My heart raced as I unlocked it, the hinges creaking ominously. I descended the stairs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was quiet now, the remnants of my encounter with the girl lingering like a distant memory. But as I approached the spot where the mirror had been, I felt a chill wash over me. The mirror was gone, replaced by a blackened stain on the wall. What did I do? I whispered, my voice echoing in the silence. Help me. The voice was faint, but it was there, echoing from the shadows. My heart sank as I realized the girl was still trapped, and the darkness had returned, feeding on her anguish. I felt a sense of responsibility for the girl. I had freed her from one prison, only to send her back into another. Guilt washed over me as I stood in the basement, staring at the darkened spot where the mirror had been. Help me. The voice was clearer now, pleading and desperate. I knew I had to do something, but what? Is there a way to help you? I called out, my voice trembling. Silence filled the air, and I felt the shadows shifting around me, growing restless. Then the girl's voice broke through again, stronger this time. Find the mirror. Find the truth. I steeled myself, determination rising within me. I had to uncover the secrets of this house, to confront the darkness once and for all. Over the next few days, I researched the house's history, combing through old records and newspaper articles. I discovered that the house had been abandoned for years before I moved in, but there were whispers of strange occurrences, disappearances, whispers in the dark, and a child's laughter echoing through the halls. The girl's name was Lila. She had lived in the house long ago, and the stories told of her tragic fate. She had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but memories and unanswered questions. As I delved deeper, I uncovered clues that hinted at the location of the original mirror, the key to releasing Lila from the shadows. I felt a sense of urgency to find it, to free her from the darkness that had consumed her. With the information I had gathered, I searched the house meticulously. Finally, in the attic, I discovered a hidden door behind a stack of old boxes. My heart raced as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, I found remnants of the past, dusty furniture, faded photographs, and in the corner, covered with a thick sheet, stood an ornate mirror. I felt a surge of hope as I approached it. This had to be the mirror that held Lila's essence. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I pulled the sheet away. The mirror gleamed in the dim light, but the reflection that stared back at me was not just mine. Lila stood beside me, her form flickering like a candle flame. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You have to break the curse." "What curse?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The mirror holds the darkness," she explained, her voice growing fainter. "It feeds on fear and sorrow. You must break it to free me." I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I picked up a heavy object, ready to destroy the mirror once and for all. But as I raised it above my head, Lila's expression shifted. "No, wait," she cried. "You must be careful. If you break it wrong, the darkness will consume you." I paused, uncertainty flooding my mind. I needed to free her, but I couldn't risk losing myself in the process. "Tell me what to do," I urged, desperate for guidance. Lila took a deep breath, her form shimmering as she gathered her strength. "You have to confront the darkness within the mirror. Stand strong in your light, and it will shatter." With her words echoing in my mind, I took a deep breath and steadied myself. I raised the heavy object once more, but instead of swinging blindly, I focused on the mirror, channeling every ounce of light and positivity I could muster. As I swung down, the mirror didn't shatter. Instead, it rippled like water, and the darkness surged forward, a wave of shadows eager to consume me. "Stand firm," Lila urged, her voice cutting through the chaos. You are stronger than it." With determination, I pushed against the shadows, feeling the weight of their malevolence pressing down on me. I concentrated on the light within me, envisioning it growing brighter until it enveloped me. "Let go," I shouted, letting the light flow through me. The shadows screamed, twisting and writhing as they fought against the brilliance. The mirror began to crack, light pouring through the fractures like beams of hope. With one final powerful blow, the mirror shattered, sending shards flying through the air. The darkness recoiled, and a blinding light erupted from the broken glass. I felt a rush of energy as the light consumed the shadows, enveloping the room in warmth. The whispers faded, replaced by a calm silence. Lila stood before me, her form radiant and free. "Thank you," she cried, joy radiating from her. "You've set me free." As the last remnants of darkness faded away, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. The shadows had been vanquished, and in their place was a light that filled the room with warmth and love. The house felt different now. The weight of the past had lifted, replaced by a sense of renewal. I could still feel Lila's presence, her gratitude radiating like a warm embrace. I spent the next few days cleaning the attic, clearing away the remnants of the past. The house that had once felt so heavy with darkness was now filled with light and possibility. As I moved forward, I knew that Lila would always be a part of my journey. I had freed her from the darkness, and in doing so, I had discovered my own strength. Weeks passed, and I found comfort in the light that now filled my home. The whispers had vanished, replaced by laughter and joy. Story 6. It was a quiet night, the kind where the world outside feels still, almost as if it's holding its breath. I was halfway through a book, the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the windows, when I heard the knock. At first, I thought it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the rain mixing with my fatigue. But then it came again, soft but deliberate. 3 knocks. I froze, my eyes darting to the door. It was nearly midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. The sound was unnerving in its simplicity. No urgency, no insistence, just a quiet, measured knock. I glanced at my phone. No missed calls, no messages. Who could it be? The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I stood up, a creeping sense of unease settling in. I didn't want to answer the door, but the knock came again, this time louder. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. My footsteps felt heavy as I approached the front door, the faint light from the hallway casting long shadows across the floor. I peered through the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. I blinked, wondering if I had imagined it. But the knock, it had been real. I could still feel the echo of it reverberating through the house. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and cracked it open, just enough to peer outside. The rain had picked up, falling in heavy sheets that obscured the street beyond. The porch light flickered, casting a dim, yellowish glow over the wet steps. No one stood there, no figure loomed in the rain. The street was empty. I shut the door quickly, locking it again and leaning my back against it. My heart pounded in my chest. Maybe it was just kids playing a prank. Maybe the rain had distorted the sound. Either way, I wasn't in the mood to find out. I returned to the living room, but the uneasy feeling stuck with me. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window made me jump. Eventually, I gave up on reading and decided to call it a night. It must have been around 3 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. My body stiffened immediately, every nerve on high alert. I lay perfectly still, trying to pinpoint the sound. It wasn't coming from outside. No, these footsteps were inside the house. I strained to hear over the thudding of my heartbeat. The soft, rhythmic steps were unmistakable, moving methodically across the floor downstairs. My mind raced. Had someone broken in? Was there really an intruder in my home? I carefully reached for my phone, my hand trembling as I clutched it. I unlocked it, preparing to dial 911, but I stopped myself. The footsteps had changed. They were slower now, dragging across the floor like something heavy was being pulled. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. Whoever it was, they were moving closer to the stairs. I sat up in bed, every instinct screaming at me to hide, to call for help, but a strange paralysis gripped me. I didn't dare move. I listened as the footsteps reached the base of the stairs, the slow, dragging sound making its way up, step by step. It was coming for me. My breathing became shallow, my hands cold with fear. I was about to hit the call button on my phone when the footsteps stopped. Dead silence filled the house. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I waited. Seconds felt like hours, and I could hear nothing but the ringing in my ears. Slowly, I turned my head toward the bedroom door, which I had foolishly left open just a crack. My eyes strained in the dark, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. Something was standing just outside the doorway, barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the hallway. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, watching. My blood turned to ice. The figure was tall, too tall to be a person. Its shape was wrong, elongated and distorted, like it was stretching toward the ceiling. And though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze, heavy and oppressive, like it was boring into me. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in that horrible silence. It could have been minutes or hours. Time felt meaningless in that moment. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even think. All I could do was stare, my body frozen in place. Then, just as quietly as it had appeared, the shadow receded. The dragging footsteps resumed, this time moving away from the door, back down the stairs. I listened as they crossed the living room, each step slow and deliberate, until they faded into nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn crept through my window, I finally dared to move. My entire body ached from the tension, and my mind was still reeling from what I had seen. I stumbled out of bed, half expecting to find some sign of the intruder, but everything downstairs was exactly as I had left it. No broken windows, no forced locks, nothing. It was as if no one had been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't explain it, but the image of that towering shadow standing outside my door was seared into my mind. It hadn't been a dream. It couldn't have been. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety, unable to focus on anything. Every time I tried to shake the memory of the shadow, I felt it creeping back into my thoughts. I kept checking the windows, the locks, anything that might give me some sense of control. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that it would come back. That night, I considered staying with a friend or checking into a hotel, but something kept me rooted in place. A strange compulsion to face whatever had been in my house. Part of me needed to know if it was real. It was well past midnight when the knock came again. 3 soft, deliberate knocks. I felt a sickening sense of déjà vu as I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and marched to the front door, my pulse pounding in my ears. If there was someone out there, I was going to see them this time. But just like the night before, there was no one. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and thick with fog. The porch light flickered weakly, casting faint shadows across the empty street. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight down the steps and into the yard, but there was nothing out of place. I was about to turn back when I noticed something. A set of wet footprints on the porch, leading right up to the door. My stomach lurched. The prints were too large to belong to any normal person, and their shape was strange, almost inhuman. They stopped just inches from where I stood, as if whoever, or whatever, had knocked, had been standing right in front of me. I backed up, quickly retreating into the house and locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent house. I didn't bother picking it up. I sprinted upstairs, locking myself in the bedroom, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt thick, suffocating, as I sat on the edge of my bed, my mind racing. I couldn't keep living like this. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were faster, louder. They thudded heavily against the stairs, as though whoever was climbing them had no intention of hiding their approach. I stood frozen in place, my back pressed against the door, as the footsteps grew closer, until they stopped right outside my bedroom. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move. I could hear it breathing, deep, ragged breaths, like something massive was standing just inches away from me. Then slowly, a voice, low and guttural, whispered through the crack in the door. "I'm here." The voice sent a bolt of terror through me, so cold and so final. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a warning. It was a statement, simple and terrifying in its certainty. I'm here. I pressed my back harder against the door, as though my weight alone could keep whatever was on the other side from getting in. My mind raced with thoughts of calling the police, but deep down, I knew this wasn't something they could help with. This wasn't a break-in or some prank gone wrong. This was something much worse. The doorknob rattled gently, and my heart leapt into my throat. I scrambled away from the door, grabbing anything I could find, a chair, a nightstand, and pushed it in front of the door, creating a makeshift barricade. My hands shook as I stacked furniture, anything to keep that thing out. But the doorknob continued to rattle, more insistently now, as though the visitor was testing the barrier, seeing how strong my resolve was. Then it stopped. Complete silence. The air was so still that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, my breathing shallow and erratic. I waited, but the sound didn't return. No footsteps, no voice, just the heavy silence. Cautiously, I approached the door again, my hand hovering just over the doorknob. I wanted to open it, to see if it was gone, but the fear of what might be waiting on the other side kept me frozen in place. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything. For a moment, there was nothing. And then, in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper, I heard it again. I'll come back. The days that followed blurred into one long, terrifying nightmare. I barely slept. The house that had once been my refuge felt like a prison, every corner hiding some unseen terror. I started hearing things during the day. Footsteps in the hallway, faint whispers from empty rooms. Sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, only for it to vanish when I turned my head. I stopped going to work. I couldn't bring myself to leave the house, and even when I tried, something always held me back. It was as if the house itself had become alive, trapping me within its walls. Each night, I dreaded the knock. It didn't come every night, but when it did, it was always at the same time, just after midnight. The 3 soft knocks, followed by the heavy, dragging footsteps. Sometimes the visitor would stay outside my door, whispering in that horrible, guttural voice. Other times it would roam the house, the sound of its movements echoing through the walls. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was imagining things, but the evidence was always there. Wet footprints on the porch, shadows that shouldn't exist, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. And every time it left me with the same parting words. I'll come back. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the paranoia, it had consumed me completely. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for the visitor to return night after night. If I was ever going to be free, I had to face it. I had to confront whatever it was that had invaded my life. The clock read 11:45 p.m. when I grabbed the kitchen knife and sat in the living room, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands slick with sweat as I stared at the front door, bracing myself for the inevitable knock. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last, until finally, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard it. 3 knocks. I stood, gripping the knife so tightly that my knuckles turned white. This time, I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to face it. I approached the door slowly, every muscle in my body tense. The air felt thick with anticipation, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. With one final breath, I unlocked the door and threw it open. The porch was empty. For a moment, I stood there, blinking in confusion. The rain had started again, a soft drizzle that slicked the steps, but there was no one there. No shadow, no figure, nothing. And then I heard it. A voice, so close it could have been whispering in my ear. I'm here. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. The door to the house was still open, the dim light from inside spilling out onto the porch. And standing just inside the doorway, its long, distorted shape stretching toward the ceiling, was the shadow. It had been inside the whole time. The shadow moved slowly, its form rippling like black smoke as it stepped closer. I backed away, the knife clutched uselessly in my hand. It was no use. I knew that now. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't something I could fight. The visitor's voice, low and cold, filled the air around me. I told you, I'll come back. With each step it took, the world seemed to darken, the light from the house fading into nothingness. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the cold, oppressive presence pressing in on me from all sides. I stumbled back, my vision swimming, and in that moment, I understood. The visitor wasn't just some ghost or figment of my imagination. It was something older, something far more ancient. And it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything. As the shadow loomed over me, I dropped the knife. There was no point in fighting. My body was cold, numb as the darkness enveloped me completely. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the visitor's voice, soft and final. "I'm here." When they found the house, it was empty. The lights were on, the doors locked from the inside, but there was no sign of me. The police found nothing, no forced entry, no sign of a struggle, nothing. It was as if I had simply vanished. The neighbors told stories, of course. They spoke of strange knocks in the night, of shadows seen through the windows, but no one believed them. The house remained empty for years, a forgotten shell, until one day, someone new moved in. And on their first night, just after midnight, they heard 3 soft knocks at the door.